So these terrible, terrible dictatorships led to the kind of human rights abuses which we all know about. And it's worth saying, Manal made an allusion to the role of Israel, especially in Central America, in helping set up systems of collective punishment and using their sophisticated technology to track down and eliminate any opponents of military regimes. These human rights abuses led to international uproar. You had some amazingly brave people like the mothers of the plaza, the women who were protesting to find out what had happened to 30,000 disappeared in Argentina. And gradually pressure was put on Western governments, the United States, Britain, etc., to put pressure on the military regimes. And as a result, there was a managed transition to apparently democracy. But it was a democracy of puppets, a democracy of people put in precisely to accept neoliberal policies, which were emerging then from the 1980s, and what was known as the Washington Consensus. Washington's own consensus. It would control Latin America, and it would use its natural resources, its multinationals would thrive, and the 1980s basically is known as the lost decade. Yeah? By 1992, the standard of living was lower than it had been 10 years earlier. Millions of people had been plunged into absolute poverty. Let's look at the situation in Venezuela when Chavez takes over. This is 1998, the rationale for radical change. Venezuela is the largest foreign oil supplier to the US. And in 1980, the oil exports from Venezuela had earned it over 50 times the value of the Marshall Plan. It should have been an incredibly wealthy country. Well, it was statistically, but its foreign debt repayments were 30 billion. 30% of GDP every year was leaving the country. Inflation was 20%, 80% of its population of 23 million people lived in poverty, 36% earn less than $1 a day, right? And these are people without a support network. 25% of the adult population was unemployed. That's not to mention that actually the vast majority were underemployed. And the poorest 20% were consuming 3% of GDP, the richest 20%, 60%. Infant mortality was 3 times the figure of Cuba. So, Chavez takes over in 1999 and immediately begins to foster a process of Latin American integration, reviving OPEC, first of all, cooperative agreement with Cuba, which most people will have heard about. That was the exchange of petroleum for doctors and educators, I've already mentioned. In 2001, this was extended with an agricultural cooperation agreement. And then there was an interruption in this process. Why? Because there was a counter-revolutionary coup against Chavez. He was kidnapped and then returned when the masses came down from the shanty towns and demanded he came back. That was followed by another attempt. It was a lockout by the managers of the oil company, which was nominally owned by the state, but it was actually run like a private company by interests who were aligned with imperialism. Following all this, these processes were defeated, the revolution pushes forward, and in December 2004, Cuba signs the first set of deals with Venezuela, which are under the title of ALBA, the Bolivarian Alternative for the Americas. 2005, Petrocaribe is set up. That's where Venezuela sells oil for very cheap to 14 Caribbean countries. They only pay 2% interest, and it's in the interest of the development of those countries, affording them some independence, some breathing space, as David said, from the not just the imperialist countries, but the international financial institutions. Okay, Telesur is set up. You can see there, Argentina, Uruguay, Cuba, Venezuela in 2005. This, again, is a vital element, which we've sort of touched on, the importance of information, the importance of propaganda. Again, another institution to counter the impact of you know, US and European imperialism, the ideals, the culture, the message, you know, the values, etc., in every single way, but also being able to publicise where resistance is taking place, being able to publicise where there is revolutionary movements and progress is being made. 2005, you'll also have Petrosur. It's a joining of the state companies of Argentina and Venezuela, and again, the idea is to create integration in trades between the Latin American countries, yeah, not to just go through the established neoliberal system. Okay, 2007, the Banco del Sur was set up with Argentina, Brazil, Bolivia, Ecuador, Paraguay, Uruguay, and then, to the surprise of many people, Colombia under Uribe, who is generally referred to as a fascist president, even asked for membership. And that's very interesting because it reflects that this movement of Latin American integration is gaining in credibility and legitimacy. It's seen as something that can't be ignored and something that has a lot to offer. Okay, now concurrent with these things, and as important, are the domestic measures which are taken at radical transformation, particularly in Venezuela and Bolivia. Nationalisations, social welfare programmes, social employment. These elements are very important. Remember the statistics that David was talking about the massive growth of unemployment that we're going to see around the world. Unemployment will reach, I think you said, 230 million people, etc. Well, Venezuela, Bolivia, and of course Cuba are creating jobs, right? So they are creating an alternative model, and you know, it's not inevitable. That's what they're showing. Okay, and then there's other programs which people know about very well. Operation Miracle, which was a product of the literacy campaign by Cuban educators in the poor areas of Venezuela. They discovered that many people were incapable of learning to read and write because they didn't have their eyesight. And all they needed was a very simple, cheap, quick operation to remove cataracts, and then they would be able to see, and then they could continue with their own personal development by learning to read and write. So the result was Operation Miracle, which started by Chavez providing, or Venezuela I should say, providing aeroplanes and petrol to transport Venezuelans to Cuba to have eye operations, but now it has extended all over Southern America, and those operations are taking place in other areas like Bolivia, Nicaragua. There are lots of people from the English-speaking Caribbean who have also benefited from this, and there's some incredible goal. I think it's 10 million people who will have their sight recovered by within 10 years of the programme, and they're well on the way to doing that. And finally, the energy revolution, which we've written about in the newspaper, which is to replace old, inefficient equipment, material, but also power generators with new equipment and new power generators. And Cuban technicians first went to Venezuela to take that to the Venezuelans, and Venezuela has now taken that further afield to Bolivia and Nicaragua. The Bolivarian Alternative for the Americas. The members, it's known as ALBA. I should say to you, those of you who don't speak Spanish, that ALBA means dawn in Spanish. So it's a lovely acronym. The members of ALBA at the present are Venezuela, Cuba, Bolivia, Nicaragua, Dominica, Honduras. And they are involved in projects of humanitarian, economic and social cooperation through non-market, non-profit-based exchanges. However, it's not just these countries affected, because their summits have been attended by and other deals have been signed with Antigua, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Vincent, the Grenadines, Uruguay and Ecuador. And those countries are also involved in joint enterprises and programs of health, education, energy, communications, transport, housing, food and mining. There's also bilateral agreements between Venezuela and many of its neighbouring countries.